Hey, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. Peter Bergen here for the New America Foundation. Susan Glasser, the executive editor of Foreign Policy magazine. We're going to have a discussion about the book.
Yes, that's our brief pared-back introduction. Peter really needs no introduction to most of you. He has not only written The Longest War, but he's been deeply engaged with covering, writing and thinking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, the war on terror, quote-unquote, for the whole decade that it's played out. And before that, he's a CNN terrorism analyst in addition to his New America portfolio. He is also the editor of the AFPAC channel on foreignpolicy.com, which is a collaboration that we have for the last couple years. And he is the author of several other books in addition to The Longest War, all of them really in some ways circling back to this main theme. And I think without further ado, that's the right way to jump into our conversation today. We'll be getting to your questions later on, and I know that's something we're both looking forward to. So when it does come time, there'll be microphones here, and please introduce yourself and your organization if you can before you do your question. So Peter, this is your magnum opus in many ways. You wrote about this in a book salon we hosted on our website. You talked about how actually the first draft of the book was 1,000 pages long, and in the interests of the readership, you spent some difficult time paring back. What did you most hope to accomplish in writing the book? This is in a way a familiar story for us after 10 years.
Well, yeah, it's almost going to be the longest book instead of the longest war, but I cut it from 240,000 words to 145,000. It's much better as a result. Susan is one of the world's greatest editors, knows, concision is definitely helpful, particularly when you're trying to cover this much ground. I mean, I part of this was just I taught courses at Kennedy School and Johns Hopkins about this subject, and kind of pretty aware of what's been written and what hasn't been written. And I know that there is no single volume that's really looked back at kind of tried to tell the whole picture, because there have been great books, Thomas Ricks on Iraq, some good books on Afghanistan, some very good books on Al-Qaeda. I mean, Mike Troya's first book, some great books on Mark Sageman's first book, Understanding Terror Networks, but nothing that tried to sort of boil it all down. So if somebody had an interest who was either a general reader or somebody with perhaps more understanding of the issue, that it was sort of one-stop shopping. And it seemed to me that a decade after 9/11 it's far enough in the rearview mirror so we can kind of make some assessments of where Al-Qaeda failed and succeeded and where the United States failed and succeeded. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the story hasn't finished. I mean, one of the problems of the book was, where do you end the story? And I ended it, and I actually have to face this problem again because the paperback is about to come out. I decided to end it with President Obama's West Point speech on December 1st, 2009, in which he announced the new surge into Afghanistan, because that is a point at which there's a whole other story that's now going to be told about Afghanistan. And then, of course, the anniversary of 9/11 will be coming soon, the 10th.
Well, I think that's part of what makes it so painful, actually, that you wrote the title, The Longest War, and it is already the longest U.S. war, of course, but it's nowhere near finished. So when does the book end?
Well, I think the book obviously was completed before the events in the Middle East, mm-hmm. And I think the events in the Middle East mean that Al-Qaeda, one of the themes of the book is Al-Qaeda was losing the war of ideas in the Muslim mm-hmm. world, and that's, if you look at any polling data, support for bin Laden, support for Al-Qaeda, support for suicide bombing, particularly in places like Pakistan, is just cratering. From Indonesia to Morocco to Jordan, we've had a lot of polling data. And so bin Laden has lost the war of ideas in the Muslim world, not because the United States won them, which is always a very naive way of looking at it, but because they lost it. And the same thing happened with the Soviets. It wasn't not to compare them because they're very different, but of course, what's going on in the Middle East right now underlines. What is absolutely fascinating to me, Susan, is that we haven't seen a single picture of Osama bin Laden being carried by the rioters or protesters in any of these countries. nobody's spouting al-Qaeda's venomous anti-Western critique of the United States. There hasn't been a single American flag burning, which is just extraordinary. I mean, that is so, usually pro forma for that part of the world to have an American, or no Israeli flag burning. It's nothing to do with bin Laden's ideas. It's fascinating. So I think the longest war just got shorter.
Yeah. But is that not now or not yet, I think is sort of
well,
the key
that's
question.
a very good question. I mean, and, in certain countries, you could see in Yemen if al-Qaeda does have a presence there.
Or who were these rebels in Libya? I mean, I think that's an interesting
that is a very interesting question. But where Libya gets interesting, and one of the people that I interviewed, one of the principal sources in the book is Noman Ben Othman, who was an old friend of bin Laden's and went to him a year before 9/11, saying essentially attacking the United States is just a really terrible idea from a strategic point of view. Noman Ben Othman is one of the leaders of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and he was the principal negotiator between Saif al-Islam, i.e. Gaddafi's son, and the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, in which they actually came to a peace agreement. So the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and it's actually publicly rejected al-Qaeda. So we don't know who these rebels are exactly, obviously. But I would be kind of surprised if the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group was somehow now an al-Qaeda-like entity. That's not the road that they've gone down, which is not to say that al-Qaeda couldn't come in as they did in Iraq.
Well, that's exactly right. If political instability and chaos continues in Libya, in Yemen, and some of these other countries, are we sowing the seeds of something that in the future could be exploited by al-Qaeda? Many of these countries, of course, saw foreign fighters being recruited from there, heading into Iraq, to Afghanistan.
Very good point. I mean, if you look at the Sinjar documents, which were the biggest internal cache of documents we've recovered from al-Qaeda in Iraq, 41% of the fighters
were from
Libya.
Yeah.
Still
chapters to be written.
al-Qaeda. Look, there's still Marxist-Leninists in various academic campuses around the world, so there will always be people.
It's not an ideology that's going to die.
I mean, there's always going to be somebody who's going to be signing up for this somewhere. The question is how many. And one of the, if Bruce Hoffman was here, he would say the following, which I think is a very important caveat to all this, which is, the Bora Mine Health Gang had, a few dozen people in the 1970s and inflicted a huge amount of public damage on the German state with virtually no public support. So the fact that al-Qaeda is losing the war of ideas in the Muslim world is not a game changer for them necessarily, because they value one recruit more than they value 1,000 followers.
Yeah. So going back to the sort of locus up to this point of this battle with al-Qaeda, the borderlands of Pakistan and Afghanistan. General Petraeus is going to be coming here this week, and I want to circle back to the book, but let's just, since we're on current events. So General Petraeus is going to be coming here next week, give big testimony before Congress. There's a lot of question about, A, whether the U.S. is going to pull back its surge forces as we have planned to do, and B, what do you make of this sort of, once again, weirdly both optimistic and pessimistic military assessments of how the fighting is going in Afghanistan. We are 10 years into the war. In fact, that's where Peter and I met each other. I was
going to say, Susan did the best article about the Battle of Tora, Bora. Still stands up very well. And I have a chapter about the Battle of Tora, Bora.
Well, and I want to get back to that, actually, because rereading that was very interesting after 10 years of having been there together. But just quickly on where we are right now. You're
more likely to be murdered walking out of this conference room than you are to be killed in the war in Afghanistan, statistically. The murder rate in Washington, D.C. right now is 24 murders per 100,000. The death rate in the war in Afghanistan is 8 per 100,000. I think it's kind of an important data point that isn't well understood. The war in Afghanistan is just not that bad in terms of the actual violence that is going on. By the way, more people are dying in Iraq in the war right now than are dying in Afghanistan right now. And Iraq has a smaller population than Afghanistan. 4,000 Iraqi civilians died in the conflict last year. And we just had the UN report yesterday saying 2,800 Afghan civilians died in the war. So, I mean, yes, it's not going well, but it's also not going it's not going as badly as people think. 60% of Americans are now opposed to the war in Afghanistan. Up from 41% a couple of years ago. The people who have a different view of the war, by the way, are Afghans themselves. The most common polling question you can ask is do you think the country is going in the right direction? Any guesses about what Americans think about that question? The answer is about 33% in a poll taken this month think the country's going in the right direction. Afghans, by contrast, in a poll taken in December, 65% of them say their country's going in the right direction. So we may not be thinking that it's going well, but they do. And the reason that they do is very simple. They've lived through the Soviet occupation, a communist dictatorship which replaced the Soviets, a civil war dominated by warlords, and then the Taliban. No country in the world has gone through a totalitarian occupation, a communist dictatorship, a civil war, and then the Taliban. Each one of these individually would be devastating. Taken together, they're really, really bad. And so Afghans are aware that what's going on is not great, but it's much better than anything they've had in the last several decades. And you know, the biggest underreported story I think of this year, Susan, it's been reported but it hasn't been processed, is President Obama saying we're going to be in Afghanistan in large numbers till December 2014.
2014, that's right.
You remember the millions of column inches that were devoted to the surge decision?
Exactly.
which is relatively trivial compared to actually we're going to be 100,000 men and women in uniform in Afghanistan pretty much for the next 4 years. Imagine if a Republican president had put 4 more years on the clock with 100,000 men and women in uniform. The liberal side of the Democratic Party would be going nuts. And because it doesn't fit with the narrative of the Nobel Peace Prize winning president, the weak on national security Democratic Party, there's just been no reaction. But this is seismic, I think. And it's very big. I was in Afghanistan in December. Most Afghans were really quite concerned that we were really leaving in July 2011. Yeah. And now we know from Bob Gates, and it's been obvious, even Joe Biden has said, well, this drawdown is going to be pretty token.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. It was an incredible sort of Washington sleight of hand in many ways that they were able to, almost as soon as they announced that 2011 date, it was, there was not only real anxiety and concern in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but among NATO allies here in Washington, there was a sense that we had boxed ourselves in hopelessly. To have walked right out of it, seemingly, into 2014 without there being a major hue and cry is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I think it's intentional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean,
sure, he's putting the clock past his own reelection.
But I think it's intentional that he hasn't flagged it in a sort of more...
If you do a search of how many times President Obama has used the word Afghanistan, given the nature and level of our commitment there, it's pretty extraordinarily low. It's not something that he's preferred to talk about in his time. So let's turn back the clock then, a full decade, as amazing as that is, to the beginning of the story. When you went back and looked at revisited Tora, Bora, and some of these other early key moments in the conflict, were there things that changed your view of how you looked at it at the time? Were there turning points that we did not recognize as such?
As I said, Susan did by far the best piece looking at the Battle of Tora Bora, which I think was in late February 2002.
That's right.
And then then obviously I had the advantage of more time later. And what the reconstruction of the Battle of Tora Bora is pretty interesting because now we have Gary Bernsen's account, who was a CIA guy in charge in Afghanistan on the ground. We have the head of the Special Forces detachment who was on the ground. His account. We also have the accounts of people who were in Guantanamo, either to their interrogators or when they got released. Some of them gave interviews. So we're able to build up a really 360-degree picture of what happened. And we also have bin Laden's own account of the Battle of Tora Bora. And I think that one of the things that I conclude in the book is not only that bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora, which is not just my conclusion. The official U.S. Special Forces history, which you can find on the web, says that all sources intelligence pointed to bin Laden being at the Battle of Tora Bora from December 9th to December 14th, 2001. Mm-hmm. So that's the official U.S. Special Forces history. What's interesting is that in that very close election between John Kerry and George W. Bush, this actually became one of the few things that John Kerry could really use against Bush and say that he'd got wrong. And it is just a fact that George W. Bush, Vice President Cheney, and Tommy Franks all made very misleading statements about this issue as that very close-run election came towards the end. You may recall that General Tommy Franks wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about 2 weeks before the election in which he said that it was never really clear to us if bin Laden was at the battle or not. And then George W. Bush was able to point to that in speeches, saying essentially Kerry was lying, and as did Vice President Cheney. Well, I went back and did a very simple thing. I just looked at the public statements of all involved at the time, and Paul Wolfowitz was saying that, yes, in a DOD press conference, that they thought bin Laden was at Tora Bora. Cheney said the same thing on some TV interviews in December 2001. And there was a lot of data, and it was well known that he was there. And the fact is that, amongst other things, Donald Rumsfeld gave Tommy Franks the assignment of rewriting the Iraq war plan on, I would say, December 3rd, 2001. That is right at the height of the Tora Bora battle. And the Iraq war plan at the time was 800 pages. And he had to rewrite it in a week. Yeah. And they were already working around, by Tommy Franks' own account, working 7 days a week, 16-hour days. So, that might have been a little distracting. So, we just blew it. And we blew it at Tora Bora because we were victims of our own success. The overthrow of the Taliban was one of the great unconventional victories in modern history. Yeah. 300 U.S. Special Forces on the ground, 110 CIA officers, and we overthrew the Taliban in 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. But as Susan knows very well, she was at the Battle of Tora Bora, that strategy didn't work at Tora Bora because it was a different kind of battle, and Al-Qaeda, wasn't going to, they had a plan to escape. I mean, bin Laden had been visiting Tora Bora since 1985, 1986, and he actually built roads through the Tora Bora mountains.
Well, and I think that, to me, just having been there, it still is a gripping read to go back and look at that, especially because of our ability to now put it all together in 360 degrees. You talk about his sons, recounting that their father would basically frog march them and practice marching to Pakistan and over the hills of Tora Bora. I mean, to me that just really strike out. They're really on their home territory there, and
totally
there were no Americans.
Well, there were more journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora than there were American soldiers, and I can say that with a great deal of confidence.
No, that's authoritative. I think.
Yeah, because we know exactly how many. There were 12 members of the British Special Boat Service, and about 60. U.S. Special Forces, CIA officers, and Air Force controllers, so for a total of about 70. There were at least 100 journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora, based on an account that Nick Robertson did for me, the CNN's lead international correspondent. I also corresponded with Susan on this point. If CNN could get themselves there, and if Fox could get themselves there, and the Washington Post, I mean, the fact that we couldn't get there, we, the U.S. military, there are some counter arguments. It's mountainous. Where were the, helicopters are difficult to get in, but, the point is it was never tried. There was no effort to try to see if we could get more people in.
Well, I also think it's really, in a way, right, it's sort of a metaphor for the American engagement in Afghanistan for the decades since then. If you put aside Al-Qaeda being on its home territory and, having a very concrete plan to escape, their point was not to have a pitched battle there, but to live to fight another day. Look at how the U.S. was really played on the ground by the different warlord factions. There were 3 major factions of the Afghan anti-Taliban movement represented there on the ground. Huge amounts of cash that we were handing out to all of them, really. And no one actually seemed very interested in fighting in all this. There was not a lot of fighting. There was a lot of B-52s flying overhead. In a lot of ways, right, that kind of reflects the war as we've seen it play out and ebb and flow for 10 years since then.
Very good point. I mean, and another point is that, we know from General DeLong was Tommy Franks' deputy, and he's written an autobiography that I found pretty useful because it actually gets to what they were thinking in sort of real time. And one, in his autobiography, he said that Rumsfeld was asking him every day, "Did we get him in that cave? So it was obvious that they knew that bin Laden was at Tora Bora, but they were also very concerned about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, and they were very concerned that Americans would be treated as antibodies, and that the more boots on the ground, the more antibodies would be created. And also, don't forget, this also came in the context of a great deal of ideological opposition to nation building. So, all these things taken together, no one wanted to put sufficient numbers of troops in. And then also don't forget that the U.S. military was very casualty resistant at the time. Don't forget the fact that the Battle of Kosovo The war in Kosovo, no American casualties. And if you look at what the concerns in Bob Woodward's first book, the real concerns the Pentagon had most of the time in the run-up and during the Afghan war was how do we get search and rescue teams in? So it wasn't like how do we actually get the job done. It was like we won't do anything until the search and rescue teams are in. Now it's very hard to put ourselves back now that we've had 4,500 casualties in Iraq and 1,500 in Afghanistan. It's hard to remember how casualty resistant and averse DOD was at the time. And also, by the way, they had no plan for Afghanistan. This is the other astonishing thing. I mean, and this is by Tommy Frank's own account, Doug Fife's own account. I mean, everybody, they all agree that they didn't have a plan. You know, that when Bush was presented with their plan, he basically said, you don't have a plan.
Right. And that's why the CIA took the lead.
That's why the CIA took the lead. That's why George Tenet and the CIA did have a plan.
Yeah. So tell me about how President Karzai evolves through the book. Obviously, he's a very different character and actor in the drama that's still playing out right now. He's clearly very publicly soured on the United States right now. He's talked over the last few months about not only his willingness to negotiate with the Taliban, but he's even at various points voiced frustration, said he wished he was the Taliban. We've just now, it appears the United States has just killed one of his distant cousins, which is sure to sort of aggravate an already very poisoned situation. Flashback in time again to this early period. He was a very pro-American interlocutor when you first encountered him.
Well, let me just say something like Karzai that I think is important, which I think explains some of his reactions to these civilian casualties.
Yeah.
Karzai very narrowly escaped being killed on December 5th, 2001. A 2,000-pound bomb dropped on him and his security detail from the Special Forces, 3 of whom were killed. Others were quite severely wounded, and he escaped relatively lightly. But the fact that this is an issue that is something that he felt rather directly. But so, why was he... he was one of the scenes I have in the book is why Karzai? Why was Karzai selected? And in his defense, I mean, we've selected some pretty bad people in the past, or people who've turned out to be, absolutely horrible, or tried to select. Whether it's Ahmed Shalabi, and who, when in polling, Ahmed Shalabi was scoring less than Saddam Hussein after the invasion of Iraq. So that was not so. So Karzai, I mean, he did get 49% of the vote in the last election, which. He thought he got 54%, or he tried to fix it that he had 54%. So he's not, even with all the things that we know about him, by historical standards in Afghanistan, he's looking pretty good. If you think about the Soviets, Najibullah, Mullah Omar, he looks pretty good. If you look at think about him regionally, compare him to Ahmadinejad or Karimov, who boils people alive for forensic purposes, or look at or even Zardari or any. Mm-hmm. So I'm not as down on Karzai as a lot of people are. And Afghans aren't as down on him as we are, I think. I mean, he's still relatively popular. But how has he changed? I think he hasn't changed that much, actually. I think the one thing that was misunderstood by a lot of people is what an adept politician he is, with a very small p. He's not a statesman. He's a very adept politician. If you go back to the 2004 period when he was the first presidential election, he did a lot of maneuverings that he did again in the most recent one, which is he sidelined all his enemies or promoted them to House of Lords jobs. I mean, so whether it was, and if you go back to 2004, he turned Ismail Khan, the governor of Herat, a very powerful figure, into the Minister of Energy. So kind of got him out of the way that way. He made Marshal Fahim his vice presidential candidate. Again, sort of drawing these alternative power centers closer. He gave Dostum some House of Lords position in the Ministry of Defense, sort of making him less important in the North. So that's how he's always operated. The problem is that he's been handed, the people around him. I just interviewed Dr. Abdullah, and who's of course opposed to Karzai and knows him very well. And he's just so angry about Karzai. He's incensed because they feel that this guy, who was a very minor figure. I mean, Dr. Abdullah was very much one of the people who basically said Karzai was acceptable.
Well,
to the
that's right.
Alliance.
That's in your book.
Yeah. So Ambassador Dobbins comes in to Afghanistan with Dr. Abdullah, and the big question is who's going to run Afghanistan in this fall of 2001. And the question, it's got to satisfy the Pakistanis, it's got to satisfy the Northern Alliance, and it's got to satisfy the United States. And there's very few things these groups will all collectively agree upon, but they all agreed on Karzai. And so Dobbins asked Abdullah, would Karzai be acceptable to the Northern Alliance? And Abdullah said yes. So Abdullah feels very strongly now that Karzai was given this huge gift and he's just squandered it, and I think that that's the feeling that people the sort of people who know him well feel that. I mean, he could have been Jinnah of Afghanistan, and instead he's turned out to be something less. And he's also been given the gift again. He's got another 4 years on the clock.
That's right. Yeah. So, Iraq is a theme that runs through the book. Both in terms of how it colors and really undermines the effort in Afghanistan from the start, and also when you look back into what was happening here in Washington, I think you've really added to making a seamless account there. What did you learn in researching that part of the book that maybe hadn't come out as clearly for you before?
Well, two things about Iraq. One, I recount the story of a kind of relatively obscure academic called Laurie Milroy.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're getting into that.
Who I think was quite one of the critical factors about why we went to war with Iraq. Because I don't get into the WMD story because it's been so well covered, but even if you accepted the most sky is falling view of Saddam's supposed WMD program, they didn't threaten the United States. So you had to make the case, this was the chain of logic. Saddam had a WMD program. He was allied to terrorists, including Al-Qaeda. Therefore, he could give the WMD to the terrorists. Therefore, he threatened the United States. So you needed all that logic chain to actually say that Saddam was a threat to the United States. But Saddam was involved in terrorism. Yes, he did pay money to the families of Palestinian suicide bombers, but you had to make the connection that he was actually allied to Al-Qaeda. And the evidence for that was even before the war, was non-existent or very, 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 very small. And Laurie Milroy sort of helped make the intellectual case, and was that Saddam, in fact, had been involved in every act of anti-American terrorism, going back to the first Trade Center attack in '93. And her thinking and her work was influential on Paul Wolfowitz, Jim Woolsey, Richard Pearl, all the people that were sort of banging the drums for war the loudest. And it wasn't just that her views sort of conveniently confirmed their own desire to overthrow Saddam. They began to really believe that she was true, that Saddam had been behind the first Trade Center attack. Paul Wolfowitz firmly believed this because he tried to make Ramzi Youssef, the guy who led the first Trade Center bombing, into an enemy combatant, who was so that he would somehow eventually admit, yes, I'm an Iraqi agent, which luckily DOJ turned down. But so Laurie Milroy is one of these sort of characters who hasn't received, I think, as much attention as perhaps as it is deserved. But then, of course, the Bush administration then went on to persuade that 70% of Americans that Saddam had been involved in 9/11. If you look at polling data taken 6 months into the war in Iraq, 70% of Americans thought that Saddam had played a personal role in the attack on 9/11. Which is astonishing, because the 9/11 investigation had concluded already that was not the case.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember being in Kuwait and watching the American soldiers preparing for war and writing, New York and remember 9/11, things like that on the side of their bombs, on the side of their airplanes. This was the stated reason for many of them who went off to that war in Iraq. So just to go back to Laurie Milroy, that's a very interesting argument. There's been some discussion, I think, in some of the commentary about your book, whether this sort of obscure academic deserves this title of ignominy, or whether those folks would have found a way to make the case for war in Iraq without her work.
They may well have, but they couldn't make that. I think that if you look at Laurie Milroy's work and you look at the acknowledgments, which is always a very useful way of sort of. And also the people who blurbed the book. I mean, it was all the people I've just mentioned.
Sure.
And so, the reason that I think this is important is that the State Department every year, as you know, releases its terrorism report. And it was the official conclusion of the United States State Department in 2000 and 2001 that Saddam hadn't been involved in any act of anti-American terrorism since the failed attempt to assassinate George H.W. Bush in Kuwait in '93. So why then would, as soon as the attack happened on 9/11, was Rumsfeld saying, let's see if Saddam was involved. We know now from Rumsfeld's memoirs that Bush was telling him to plan for a war in Iraq within 2 weeks. I mean, this was like a very, very front lobe issue for them.
So tell us how the Bush administration shakes out in your going back and really reconstructing their roles here.
They come out of it horribly in the run-up to 9/11. the 9/11 Commission was, this amazing piece of work, and one of the things that's so great about it is the footnotes are just rich with information, and that of great interest to future historians. And the 9/11 Commission was set up in such a way that it was not supposed to hold people to account, in a sense. It held institutions to account appropriately, but because it was bipartisan, it wasn't going to criticize really the Clinton administration or the Bush administration in any meaningful way, and it didn't. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the job of historians is to try and hold people to account. And if you look, I did some very simple things. Nexus searches for anything that any senior Bush official said about Al-Qaeda or bin Laden before 9/11, mm-hmm. you come up with a big zero. And this is a group that called themselves the Vulcans. They prided themselves on their, it was on paper the most experienced national security group in history.
Right. They were security focused.
They were going to really be looking after us, and then they presided over the biggest national security failure in American mm-hmm. history, and and they also, I think, prevaricated, I guess is the word I'd use about what they were doing in the summer of 2001. That's a polite Washington way of saying lying. To give you an example, Condoleezza Rice testified that the Bush administration was at battle stations mm-hmm. in the summer of 2001. Yeah. Well, two pieces of data that suggest that's not the case. One, President Bush took the longest presidential vacation in 3 decades in the summer of 2001. And two, the very day that he was briefed on August the 6th with mm-hmm. the famous bin Laden determined to strike in the United States, Condoleezza Rice gave a very very wide-ranging interview on Fox News, which discussed, Israel, China, and nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or bin Laden. And I can give you many other examples of how asleep at the switch they were, and there are, why were they asleep at the switch? It just, I use the quip about the Bourbon monarchs. When they came back after the French Revolution, they'd forgotten nothing and learned nothing. And that was really true of the Bush administration. They kind of remained stuck in this amber of the Cold War mindset, and a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda they couldn't process the information they were getting about what a threat it was.
Right. On some level, right, that seems, at least you're making an intellectual argument about their ability to process. It's not dissimilar to these Arab revolutions that have just sprung up over the last few months. There was plenty of reporting inside the U.S. Intelligence Committee and in the public sphere to suggest that Egypt and Tunisia and many of these countries were ripe for revolution. That didn't necessarily mean that we had any way of listening to the considerable amount of noise we had. But then, flash forward, Iraq. That's where I find the story gets even more interesting and puts some blame even more directly on their shoulders, right? These new accounts in Rumsfeld memoir, some controversy, by the way, among Bush veterans about whether they actually believe Rumsfeld's account that Bush personally told him to look into Iraq war plans 2 weeks after 9/11.
I can tell you, I believe that because independently we have, I'll just give you quick pieces of data there. David Gordon? Michael Gordon. If you look at Michael Gordon's book about, Rumsfeld ordered within about 3 or 4 days, the army group in Atlanta to look into what it would take to seize Iraq's southern oil fields. And that was within 3 or 4 days of 9/11. There's a lot of, I think, independent. And then if you look at Dick Meyer's autobiography, he came in as the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I think, within about 4 weeks of 9/11, and almost immediately was being tasked by Rumsfeld too. So I believe that, to me, it doesn't seem at all implausible that Bush and Rumsfeld would have had that conversation 2 weeks after 9/11. Mm-hmm.
What about Colin Powell and Condi Rice? I think that's where you come down in a very clear-cut way as not absolving them, but putting them much more in the center of the story than some people might.
Well, I don't know. Secretary Powell found out about Guantanamo on TV. The decision to have an indefinite detention regime in Guantanamo was something he found out about on television, and he, of course, was the person in the U.S. government who would have to deal most directly with the 4 nations with nationals at Guantanamo. Maybe he should have resigned. I don't know. I don't take a position on that. But having done all this Bush bashing, I want to then say that a lot of the book is about the Bush's decision to do the surge, which is a shorthand for a whole series of decisions, including replacing Casey with Petraeus, having a new strategy, counterinsurgency strategy, as opposed to standing the Iraqis up while we stand down, which was losing the war. And he did that, by the way, with, I thought this was the worst, I thought, and probably lots of people in this room thought he was doubling down on a bad bet. Senator Lugar, the dean of the Republican Party on the Foreign Affairs Committee, basically was against the surge. Chuck Hagel was saying this is the worst idea since Vietnam. Foreign Policy was doing polls of the 100 leading foreign policy experts, all of whom said the Iraq surge was a totally bad idea, almost all of them. So the entire foreign policy establishment, good chunks of his own party, Senator Barack Obama, Senator Hillary Clinton, they all said the surge idea was just an absolutely bad idea. And of course it turned out to be quite a good idea. That doesn't absolve him for the even worse idea of invading Iraq in the first place. But he did, he made a lot of the right decisions, and they weren't necessarily very clear at the time. There was a very limited universe of people who shared these views. Megan O'Sullivan, her deputy Brett McGurk at the National Security Council, General Jack Kane, the former vice chief of the Army, Fred Kagan, who ran that sort of scenario at American Enterprise Institute. But these were, it was a kind of almost like a guerrilla. It was like an insurgency against the organized army, sort of saying, we want to do something different here. And it turned out to be the right approach. Historians will still, be grappling with the problem of was the Iraq War, sort of the worst foreign policy decision of the last several decades, which you can make the argument for, because if you look at either the stated reasons or for the war, none of them came to fruit. The WMD wasn't there. Al-Qaeda wasn't allied to Saddam. Peace did not come to the Middle East. There wasn't a democratic domino effect. Israel doesn't become, suddenly embraced by its Arab neighbors. Fuad Ajami was claiming that before the war. There was a whole series of things, none of which turned out to be true. And Iraq is still a work in progress. It could have been much worse.
One of the things that I think makes the book so engaging to read is not only that you tell the story of what's happening here in Washington, but that you are engaged with the other side of the war in a way that many official accounts of this are not. Looking at the war of ideas, as you call it, in the Muslim world, looking at al-Qaeda's propaganda, you call the war perhaps the first war on the web, or certainly of the true web era. What do you think when you look at not the U.S. Account of the war, but the jihadist perspective of the war?
Yeah, one of the theories of the book was that we've had histories of World War II only told from FDR and Churchill's perspective would just be nonsensical. So,
that's right.
I try to get as much, not to suggest moral equivalence, but as much of a Bin Laden and what he was thinking and Al-Qaeda in there as well. And, I believe in the great man theory of history in the sense that certain people make a very limited group of people actually change history. And Bin Laden is one of those people. And so I have a chapter on his personality and his thinking, because without him, we wouldn't be sitting in this room having this discussion, because there wouldn't have been Al-Qaeda and there wouldn't have been 9/11, I don't think. When you join Al-Qaeda, you swear a personal oath of allegiance to Bin Laden. And I hate making comparisons to the Nazis because it's a very, very different type of group, but there is one similarity. When you joined the Nazi Party, you didn't swear an oath of allegiance to Nazism, you swore a personal oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler. So Al-Qaeda is not a democracy, it's a very top-down organization, and that is one of the reasons that they made this huge strategic error of attacking the United States on 9/11, which seemed like this big victory to Al-Qaeda and to everybody around the world, but it turned out to be a strategic failure for Bin Laden. Why a strategic failure? For two reasons. First of all, what was he trying to achieve? He was trying to get the United States out of the Middle East so the authoritarian regimes like the Mubaraks and the Saudi royal family would collapse, because once we withdrew our support, they would collapse. How did he come to that conclusion? He came to that conclusion because he looked at the Soviet experience. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the client regimes in Eastern Europe then collapsed. And then he assumed, because we pulled out of Vietnam, Somalia in 93 and Beirut in 83, that we were as weak as the Soviet Union, which is an extraordinary conclusion to have come to. And we weren't going to pull out of New York just because we were attacked in New York. So none of this made any sense from a strategic point. But Bin Laden firmly believed his own strategic analysis. And against the advice, I mentioned Noman Ben-Othman, but there were several others people that I mentioned in the book who said to Bin Laden, actually, maybe attacking the United States is not such a good idea, either from our own point of view, in the sense that we're trying to overthrow these authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and it won't achieve that goal, or because it may even be against Islam. I mean, some people in Al-Qaeda itself were saying sort of unprovoked attacks on civilians going to work on a Tuesday morning wasn't religiously sanctioned. And so there was one of the things I try and do in the book is try and get at this, the fact that bin Laden made these decisions against quite a lot of the more thoughtful people in his inner circle was saying this is actually not a good idea. And some of the people also, so when 9/11 happened, we recovered documents, internal documents within Al-Qaeda where they were saying, hey, this was an incredibly dumb idea. Let's try and rein bin Laden in. Let's not do more of this. Let's try and regroup. This is destroying not only just Al-Qaeda, but every jihadi movement around the world. So one of the big ideas in the book is that 9/11 was a strategic failure in terms of what bin Laden hoped to achieve. And then also, even worse for the organization, Al-Qaeda means the base in Arabic. They lost their base in Afghanistan. They never recovered anything similar. They have reorganized to some degree, but it's a pale shadow of what they once had. And just one final point on that. This was the most bureaucratic, or arguably the most bureaucratic terrorist group in history. They had 36 pages of bylaws, including stuff like furniture allowances, how much people should get paid if they had 1 wife, 2 wives, 3 wives, 4 wives. They had, vacation policy.
It's nice to know there's a 4-wife supplement.
There is, yeah. They had a vacation policy that was much more generous than anything we get, 2.5 months for a member of Al-Qaeda. So all that was lost in the post 9/11 era, and that. And don't forget, by the way, the Taliban was about to take over Afghanistan. They killed Ahmad Shah Massoud 2 days before 9/11. That was the one thing that stood in the way of them taking over. And in fact, I was going into CNN to try. The Northern Alliance tried to disguise that fact because they knew that without Massoud, that this was a huge morale problem for their troops. They tried to disguise it, and people around who knew Massoud pretty well told me that he was actually dead. And I was going into CNN the morning of 9/11 to talk about this, big event. And of course, then it became a much bigger event. But if the Taliban would be in power today in Afghanistan, if we had, I interviewed people in the book and also friends of mine. As soon as they heard on the BBC Arabic service or that the Al-Qaeda had attacked New York, they were like, "Great, the Taliban is gone." I mean, the smarter ones understood that the game was over for the Taliban.
Or not, as the case may be, right?
Well, I think the game is still pretty much over for the Taliban.
Yeah. So I think it would be great to get some questions going right now. I know Peter wants to. Andrew is here in the back with the microphone, so he's going to bring it. We have a couple right up front here to get us started, and then I hope we can go into the back, too.
Ken Dillon, CNCO Press. What is your interpretation of the outcome of the anthrax mailings investigation?
What is my interpretation of the outcome of the anthrax investigation? The National Academy of Sciences recently produced a report that suggested that some of the evidence the FBI relied on was not 100%. But, I'm not a scientist, but my impression is that doesn't necessarily mean that the FBI was wrong. It just means that there is still some discussion about the evidence. The FBI also would say, I think, that it wasn't just the scientific evidence, it was also the totality of what Bruce Ivins was. And Mike Lind, who's my colleague here, told me a long time ago that in law school you're told that suicide and flight are two usually pretty reliable signs of guilt. Bruce Ivins did commit suicide. Maybe it's hard to tell now if he was in the absence of other candidates, he seems like the person most responsible. That does raise the issue. I have a whole chapter called Al-Qaeda's quixotic quest for weapons of mass destruction, and one of the big takeaways of the book, I think, is that this concern about Al-Qaeda and weapons of mass destruction was overwrought, to put it mildly. Their experimentation with anthrax never got past the most amateur level. They never acquired pathogenic anthrax, so they never acquired anthrax and kill anyone. They experimented in a very amateur way with ricin. They weren't Bruce Ivins. Bruce Ivins was one of the leading microbiologists in the United States. He killed 5 people. It's hard to actually build an effective biological weapon. And terrorists, generally speaking, aren't nuclear scientists. We've just released yesterday, New America Foundation, Andrew Leibovich with the microphone, and I've been working on this for a long time. We looked at 177 jihadist terrorist cases in the United States since 9/11. Really interesting takeaway. Not a single one of these cases involved chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological weapons. So I think that sort of speaks for itself. Terrorists are just going to continue doing what they've done before truck bombs, things that are relatively easy to do.
Right there in the
Hi, Peter. Thank you, Susan. I'm Rob Dubois. I'm a security advisor currently at the Joint IE Defeat Organization. And I think the reason they have a good pension plan, or no pension plan, is that because they're going to die, so they can give more vacation time there in the organization. On the subject of the soft guys in Iraq or Afghanistan, my own platoon did the hydro recon of Pakistan to let the invasion roll in. And when we tried to tag our SEAL platoon to the Marines going up and to establish Camp Rhino, the commander told us all the jump seats were taken up by journalists. So we couldn't get warriors into the war because you guys were there.
Okay, so
the question is, I talked to
We
Dave
didn't get
Barno.
a ride from the military, let me just say. In fact, I
found
never
another
saw
way?
an American soldier in Afghanistan until I'd been there for 5 months.
Yeah. Well, we were very, very reserved on that entry. Dave Barno was the commander 0405, and we talked this week about his CNAS proposal to stay at maintain presence in Afghanistan, but draw down starting July 11, back down to 35 or 25,000 eventually. And New America has just done, of course, with the Matt Ho and all, the basically get out now as much as possible concept. What you're saying seems to be status quo is all right because there is a less lethal problem we have with our presence in Afghanistan. Are you running counter to the AFG, or pro Barno? Or
Well, look, I mean, two things. First of all, David Barno's report has been OBE, to use a military term I think that you're familiar with, overtaken by events. I mean, look, the decision's already been made. We're going to be in Afghanistan until December 2014 in large numbers. So we're not going to be drawing down in July 2011. As to the Afghanistan Study Group, just to clarify something, I didn't sign that document. It wasn't a New America document. People are allowed to have whatever views they want. This is a democracy of ideas here, but it wasn't something that I signed on to, and I don't agree with it. But it's not based on just my personal feelings. It's based on, if you 62% of Afghans in the most recent poll have a favorable view of international forces in their country. Can you think of a single Muslim country that has a favorable view of the U.S. military at that level? I can't think of one. And we've been there for 10 years, and the numbers have gone down from about 80%. But the Afghans don't want us to leave, they just want us to perform.
I think that's an important point. Yes, sir.
Peter, you're a really great guy. You do great work, so I just want to say thanks. I was a Marine in 2001 with the very initial force in 2003. I represent an organization called Veterans for Rethinking Afghanistan. I'm a co-signer of Matthew Ho's policy, so clearly we're a little bit at odds. One of the problems I have as being a guy who served operationally is that counterinsurgency is devastating to the U.S. forces. It's incredibly difficult, the most mind-blowing kind of war, the most damaging to U.S. soldiers. I mean, an invasion on D-Day is probably more psychologically acceptable than counterinsurgency.
Why is that?
It's because you don't know who the enemy is. It's because when you see innocent women and children getting killed, it's something that creates a moral injury, something that's undescribable. And you don't know it until you've been there. And unless you put on a uniform and carry the gun, you don't have the experience. My question, though, is getting to that, is how is it that you say we want to stay status quo, et cetera, when you say 60% of Afghans, but yet the last public opinion poll done of Pakistan, 80% disapproval rating. It seems to me absolutely illogical that we would base our policy within Afghanistan based just simply on theirs alone, when the majority of Pakistanis, which is a nuclear-armed failing state, which is our continuing efforts, it seems to me is destabilizing. That any comments would be great.
Well, so a policy discussion about Afghanistan without discussing Pakistan doesn't make sense, and I mean I agree. And there are lots of ways to argue this case, both for and against. And Pakistan, it's got a lot of problems which are not going to get any better in the short term. Inflation rate there is 15% now, might go up to 25% next year. The politicians won't make the hard choices about how to deal with that problem. We've had 2 cabinet ministers assassinated because they're opposition to the blasphemy law. That said, the Pakistani military did serious operations in southern Waziristan and Swat, which is not entirely, wouldn't have been predictable 2 or 3 years ago. So, and they were also done with the support of half the Pakistani population, according to a recent opinion poll by Gallup. But, I think you've identified a big problem. I mean, are the Pakistanis going to do anything about the Haqqani network? I don't think so. I think that they've reached the ceiling of what they're prepared to do. That is a problem. I mean, Rand has a very interesting assessment, I think, of 89 insurgencies since in the past several decades. And, this is totally intuitively understandable that if the insurgents continue to have a safe haven, in about 50% of the cases, they can win. So, I agree with you. But that said, that doesn't mean that we should withdraw from Afghanistan, just because that would give the Taliban even more territory. And for the people who say that there's no evidence, I am very suspicious of the idea that the Taliban are suddenly going to morph into a group of Henry Kissingers when they take over southern and eastern Afghanistan and are going to reject Al-Qaeda and other insurgent groups. Because right now, in the territory they control in Pakistan, that's where Al-Qaeda is headquartered, that's where the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan is headquartered, that's where Lashkar-e-Taiba has bases. I mean, part of their project has been giving not only support to Al-Qaeda, but every Muslim insurgent terrorist group from around the globe. That's just been part of their modus operandi. They've had 10 years to say we reject Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, 9/11. They've never said anything along those lines, which is one of the principal conditions we have for any reconciliation. And I think it's desirable to do a deal with them if we can. That's the way insurgencies end. But we're a very long way from that point. They haven't said anything about what their plans are for women. Will they incarcerate half the population in their homes, as they did when they were in power? And we've run a controlled experiment with what life under the Taliban looks like very recently. Because in Swat, when they took over Swat, what did they do?
Right.
They burned down the girls' schools, they beheaded the policemen, and they imposed a reign of terror on the population. It's not just, I think that we have a moral obligation, having overthrown the Afghan government. This is not a strategy based on realism, which I know may be offensive to some people, but is also, we have a sort of moral obligation to kind of get it sort of right in Afghanistan. And that doesn't mean that we turn it into a Central Asian Switzerland. It just means we make it slightly more secure and slightly more prosperous. That's what the Afghans are looking for, and that's what I think is reasonable for us to achieve.
Well, I've always thought that Central Asian Switzerland stalking horse was it's what members of Congress say when they're debating Afghanistan and don't have something else to say. It's a hard thing. Oh, you've been very patient here in the front.
Hi, I'm Alexei Savchenko from the Department of State, and the question I have 2 questions. One about the reasoning of why Osama bin Laden decided to attack USA after 9/11, and I don't remember exactly the name who presented this thesis, but the idea was that it was a typical tactic of the provocateurs, which were used by many revolutionaries, particularly in the Middle East, early 20th century and late 19th century, where you attack force. Let's say you attack the United States, and the United States, of course, overreact, going back, striking back, and that causes the civilian casualties, and as a result, you got much wider support among population, and that was the reason. I wonder what you would comment on it. The second question was regarding a comment which Irving Kristol made sometime in 2002, 2003, where he said that, I don't know when, I don't know how, I don't know where, but I know for sure that the tragedy of the scale of 9/11 is going to repeat itself in the United States, and I know for sure. But what I know for sure that is going to be repeated on the name of Islam. Was he wrong?
Well, so on the second question, was Irving Kristol right to say that there'd be another 9/11 style attack that was motivated by Islam? Essentially, is that what you're asking? There have been 17 people, Americans, killed in the United States since 9/11 by jihadi terrorists. There have been 73 in the same time period killed in hate crimes, according to the FBI, and there have been about 150,000 murders. So, it doesn't make any sense, this kind of idea that that there's going to be another 9/11 style attack, and somehow Al Qaeda is incapable of doing something like that. And I mean, I don't think it would have been very predictable a year or two after 9/11 that only 17 Americans would have died in jihadi terrorist attacks in the United States in the past decade, which makes you're more likely to be killed by lightning or snake bite or drown in your own bath than to be killed by a terrorist based on those kind of standards. On the first question, was 9/11 an incredibly clever idea by Al Qaeda to provoke us to attack into the Muslim world, and then we would kill lots of civilians and then everybody would turn against us? The answer is no. There's no evidence for this assertion at all. Post facto, about 4 years after 9/11, Al Qaeda, because it basically realized it had been a strategic failure, started saying, actually, this is all part of an incredibly diabolically clever plot to bring America into the Middle East, and we would then bleed it to death, and America would piss off everybody. Quite the reverse, because the point of 9/11 was to get us out of the Middle East, so that we would withdraw our support from the Saudi regime and the Egyptian regime, and they would crumble. So there's just simply this is a post facto rationalization of their own poor strategy. It's not actually what they really wanted. They didn't want the United States to occupy Afghanistan and then Iraq and draw closer to the Mubarak regime and the Saudi regime as we did after 9/11. That was not their intention.
Razan Naqvi with Voice of America. I just wanted you to comment on the presence of Al Qaeda on the internet. How effective is it? Yeah. How good is it at using the internet? And also, I guess the flip side of that question is, how important still is territory to Al Qaeda? Is it an organization that can exist solely on the internet? Is it amorphous? Are we playing whack-a-mole with it? But I guess this is two sides of the same coin here.
Yeah. Al Qaeda means the base in Arabic, and it's not a base in virtual space. It's a base. They want a base. I mean, and Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al Qaeda, has written in his autobiography that essentially, if we don't have a state or part of a state where we can impose our sort of Taliban-style theocracy, we have achieved nothing. It's very easy for anybody in the audience to check that. Ayman al-Zawahiri's autobiography is widely available on the internet. And so by Ayman al-Zawahiri's own standard, they've achieved nothing because they don't have this space where they can do what they want to do, which is to, they want to run a sort of quasi-state. As to the effect of the internet on Al-Qaeda, I think that in the countries with the highest amount of jihadi terrorist activity, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, you have some of the lowest amount of internet usage in the world. Which I think sort of speaks for itself, right? I mean, and we don't train the American military over the internet. We train them at training bases. In the same way, effective jihadi terrorists are not people just watching beheading videos in their PJs. They are people who've gone to a training camp or a war zone. At the end of the day, killing people is not very easy, and you have to be trained how to do it, usually. Building a bomb is not particularly easy. You have to be trained how to do it. So I think a lot of this hysteria about Al-Qaeda on the internet is very, very overwrought. And in fact, there's a similar hysteria, and I can't prove this, Susan, but I think that when the historians write about the revolutions in the Middle East, Al Jazeera's role is going to be so much bigger than the role of Facebook.
And Twitter.
Facebook was useful to organize the relatively small group of people to get on the street. But what got millions on the street was the pictures on Al Jazeera of millions of people getting on the street and not being immediately killed. Because that's what was very persuasive. And there's, of course, a great irony here, because with the Bush administration, Al Jazeera was sort of essentially, the world's worst institution. But Al Jazeera has actually played a very, very large role in producing actually the democratic impulse in the Middle East. So I think that Al-Qaeda on the internet it's not insignificant. I mean, you look at Major Nidal Hassan, obviously his communications with al-Awlaki over the internet were pretty critical in his decision to actually shoot 13 American soldiers at Fort Hood. So I don't want to discount it, but I think it's easy to kind of overestimate the importance of something that is very important in our own lives and therefore must be very important in everybody else's lives, which is a case of mirror imaging, and it's not necessarily the case.
You don't think they're eagerly lining up for the new iPad today? The SWAT Valley? Do we have more questions in the back, especially? I'm hoping to get some. Let's see one back there. Oh.
Hi, Josh Meyer, National Security Journalism Initiative. Peter, as usual, you made some very smart observations, including that less people are being killed in Afghanistan as you might think, if you read the papers, that the Afghans have a better sense of the direction in which the war is going, and then more people are being killed in Iraq. I don't know if this is technically a media question, but do you think that the American public is getting a good sense of what's going on over there? I mean,
well, I think it is.
I think
expand
on some of those.
Josh is an old friend of mine who used to work at the LA Times, is now at the Medill School here. I think it's a very good question, Josh. The media. The counter argument is, Rumsfeld was, blaming the media for the coverage of the Iraq War, which he didn't blame that discussion. If Donald Rumsfeld's grandmother could have scripted the media coverage of the invasion of Iraq, so he didn't complain about that. He complained about it when things went wrong. And blaming the media, of course, is sort of the easiest thing to do, both on the left and the right. But I think that certainly, if it's not being well communicated to the American public that the Afghan war is nothing like the Iraq war, that perhaps the media takes some share of responsibility for that. I mean, the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan couldn't be more stark. If you just one quick data point, you were 20 times more likely to be killed in Iraq as a civilian in January of 2007 than you are to be killed today in the war in Afghanistan. And the violence in Iraq was just off the charts. This was an enormously violent war. In Afghanistan, Kabul, you can go and anybody in this room could go to Kabul today and have a fairly good time within certain constraints. I mean, there are restaurants and there are bars. You couldn't have a good time in Baghdad in 2007. It would just be totally, completely impossible. So the wars are very different. And the fact that it's not being well communicated, is that the media's fault? I'm not sure. When a bomb goes off, it looks bad. The pictures always look bad. But the war in Afghanistan is very different from the war in Iraq. There isn't a civil war. The size of the insurgency is much smaller. The Taliban is about 35,000 men. If you take a generous estimate, some people have compared it to Vietnam. The North Vietnamese army was 500,000 men, and it was armed by both the Soviets and Maoist China. The Taliban is not a very large insurgent group. On the other hand, they're clearly having some successes.
Some of it depends on what General Petraeus often calls the Washington clock, as opposed to the Baghdad clock or the Afghan clock, right? And the narrative of the war politically here in the U.S. clearly affects whether that reporting about Afghanistan, which many people have done such a great job with, whether it breaks through the narrative and whether there's a voice for it. You mentioned earlier the rise in American opinion polls, over 60% now wanting to end the war in Afghanistan, and I think that really is the lens through which people view the coverage.
Can I make a point about that? Peter Fever, who was an academic at Duke, who I think he writes for you now,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
he runs the shadow government.
Yeah. Well, anyway, he did this very interesting work that was, I think, one of the reasons the Bush administration hired him, which was that Americans are not casualty averse; they're failure averse. Mm-hmm. So, the reason that they turned against the Iraq War is not so much because of the casualties, but because it seemed to be going very badly. Mm-hmm. And so, it became a non-issue once the war. The casualties continued. Obviously, they were at lower rate. So Americans want to sort of see that if they sort of feel the war is sort of going okay, their view about casualties will sort of change, and I think that the lack of support for the Afghan war is it's not like this visceral dislike of the Iraq war, which I think was much more much stronger. In fact, if you look at there's a pretty easy way to measure this, which is if you look at the percentage of space devoted to stories about Afghanistan in the media, it's very small. I think in 4% or something. Iraq was massive. Afghanistan is sort of not really a subject of public discussion.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, back there, yes. Or Andrew, yeah, right there.
Hi, Peter. Romesh Ratnazar from Time and New America. Just to go back quickly to the a point you made earlier about there not being, and the reasons why there hasn't been another 9/11 in the United States. One of the things that the intelligence community has said over the last 10 years and continues to say is that the explanation is not that the intent doesn't exist or even that the capability doesn't exist, but that we've had success in foiling any number of plots that unfortunately we can't talk about. Is that true?
That isn't true, Ramesh. I don't think. I mean, it's hard to prove negatives, but the plots that fail or generally produce convictions and court cases. I mean, the biggest plot that failed that was really could have been a 9/11 style event, and I get into it in some detail in the book, is the planes plot of the summer of 2006. Fran Townsend, who was President Bush's Homeland Security advisor at the time, said this was by far the biggest thing that came across her desk that she had to deal with. Juan Zarate, her number two, in the summer of 2006. It was going to be, it was Al Qaeda's attempt to celebrate the 5th anniversary of 9/11. Hydrogen peroxide bombs smuggled onto 7 American, Canadian, and British airliners leaving Heathrow. British prosecutors said if the plot had succeeded, 1,500 people would have died. The planes would have blown up over the middle of the Atlantic. There would have been no way to do the forensics. It would have been a 9/11 style event, no doubt. But this is not a secret. We've had 3 different court cases which have gone on for years, generating literally millions of pages of documents. And so I think, Ramesh, the idea that there's things that we can't tell you, if that doesn't pass the smell test. And I think why haven't we been attacked? I think there's so many reasons for that. The Patriot Act did do some important things, bringing down the wall between the FBI and the CIA, for instance. The American Muslim community is overwhelmingly rejected the ideological virus of Al-Qaedism. The Bush administration, the Obama administration has done a number of things to keep us safe. There were 16 people on the no-fly list on 9/11. They're now sort of thousands. We have 100 joint terrorism task forces around the country. We have a whole industry of people looking at these questions, and and of course Al Qaeda is just much weaker.
Do we have? I think we have time for a couple more questions. Here.
Hi, Neil Patagone. Regional solutions to Afghanistan have been sort of a sexy buzzword recently, but I was wondering if you could comment a bit on that, the role of regional countries, Iran, India, China, so forth, in sort of the long term, in the long haul of Afghanistan.
People always say, the solution to Afghanistan is a regional one. Yeah, okay. I mean, what does that mean? It's one of those kind of like very easy to say, but much harder, because if it's really a regional settlement, it would involve Kashmir, and that ain't going to happen anytime soon. The Indians have made it abundantly clear. They made sure that Ambassador Holbrooke didn't have India as part of his portfolio. For them, the Kashmir issue is absolutely third rail. They do not want Americans involved in that, or any outsider. And they have the heft and the capability of essentially making sure that that remains the case. Now, the Pakistanis and Indians have resumed strategic dialogue. Steve Cole, our friend, boss, and my boss, and both of our friends, wrote the definitive piece in the New Yorker about what the peace deal between Pakistan and India would look like a couple of years ago. Musharraf came close to that, but then started losing. It's just like the Israeli-Palestinian agreement. We know what the framework looks like, but getting the politics to get there is pretty complicated. And the same thing, and of course, everybody in Pakistan has been fed for 60 years this diet of anti-Indianism, and of course there have been 3.5 wars between India and Pakistan. There's a great deal of mutual suspicion and hostility. This is not going to be solved very quickly. And so, agreeing with Jake here in the front, there's some sort of systemic problems about Afghanistan that just are not going to go away very easily. On the Iranian front, I thought it was fascinating that the British have recovered quite a lot of Iranian weaponry in the last 2 or 3 days coming into Afghanistan. Iran could make it much, much worse in Afghanistan. The real thing I would be looking for in Afghanistan is, are you seeing EFPs, explosively formed projectiles, showing up in the theater in Afghanistan? Because if Iran really wanted to turn the heat up, that's what we'd be seeing. As you know, EFPs can go through basically any armor and were absolutely devastating to American soldiers in Iraq. We haven't seen any example of EFPs yet, but Iran, if it wanted to, could start making our situation there much harder. So Afghanistan is is a landlocked country surrounded by a lot of people that want to kind of maintain their interests there, and it's not just the Indians and the Iranians, but it's also the Russians, and that's sort of been Afghanistan's curse. And one idea which Ambassador Inderfurth has floated, which I think is kind of an interesting one, is Afghanistan, there might be some kind of way that Afghanistan could become officially neutral. Mm-hmm. In fact, Afghanistan was neutral in World War I. It was also neutral in World War II, just as Switzerland is neutral.
I was just going to say, truly making the Switzerland of Central Asia theme come true.
Finally come true.
Right, exactly. Not just in the way that they imagined on
right. But it's a kind of an interesting idea. And there are, by the way, I think right now the United States is, all this discussion about who's right, Matthew Ho, Afghanistan Study Group, David Barno, whatever, is basically moot, because this thing is moving forward in a way very quickly. I mean, right now in the next 3 months, the United States government and the Afghan government are going to be talking about a strategic framework agreement that could look like a status of forces agreement, as we've done with the Iraqis. Some Afghans would like a treaty with us. Now, to get 66 votes in the Senate is, as we found with the START treaty, not that easy necessarily. But that, we're looking at a very long-term South Korea-style commitment that obviates all this other discussion.
Okay, one more question, and then we're done. Right here in the front, ma'am.
Susan Pierce, retired Lockheed Martin. And I'm interested in what your opinion is of the greatest threat to the U.S. today, and what we should be doing about it, and are we doing what we should be doing about it?
I think I think that historians are going to look back on this period, including 9/11, as one of the great periods of peace that the United States or the world has enjoyed, which is counterintuitive perhaps, but I think it's true. I mean, in the context, one of the themes of the book was, Clausewitz says the most important thing is, when you embark on a war, you have to properly understand the kind of war you're embarking upon. George Bush, 9 days after 9/11, came before the Houses of Congress. It was the most widely watched presidential speech, I think, in American history. 80 million Americans watched it, and he said, this is very similar to the war against the Nazis and the communists. Well, of course, that didn't make any sense. The Nazis instigated a global conflict that killed tens of millions of people, and if the Cold War had ended with a bang instead of a whimper, we wouldn't be having this conversation because we'd all be dead. And that was really existential. So now we're in a period of non-existential problems. Maybe there is a sort of Moore's law in biology right now where you're seeing tremendous advances in biology, and graduate students are doing things that 50 years ago would have been impossible. So some kind of biological terrorist attack 50 years down the road, maybe. The Stuxnet thing is very interesting, because whoever did the Stuxnet thing on Iran is like, this is a genie that is also could be turned around and directed at us. At least in theory. But I think that in the grand scheme of human history, this looks a lot like the period after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where there's a relative period of peace. I mean, to leave on an optimistic note.
Now, again, the book is called The Longest War.
But it's the longest war. It's just not a very important one.
Exactly. So thank you all so much for coming today. I know Peter will be happy to sign your books.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.